They're calling everyone back. The deputy's voice carried across the fog-covered trailhead just before dawn. Search trucks were already pulling away one by one. Volunteers folded orange maps into their pockets. A helicopter circled once above the pine-covered valley before turning east, disappearing into the pale morning sky. After 6 days, the search was over. The sheriff's office is suspending operations, someone announced through a portable loudspeaker. We'll resume only if new evidence comes in. No one argued. Faces that had arrived hopeful now looked exhausted. Boots dragged through damp gravel. Search dogs were loaded into trailers. The woods, which had echoed with voices all week, suddenly became quiet. Caleb Whitmore stood near the edge of the parking area, watching everyone leave. His backpack rested at his feet. Inside were a flashlight, a first aid kit, extra water, a weathered topographic map, and enough food for one more day. A volunteer recognized him. "You heading home?" Caleb looked toward the ridgeline disappearing into the morning mist. Not yet. The professionals already covered everything. They covered what made sense. The volunteer sighed. "She's been missing almost a week." "I know. If she were still alive." He never finished the sentence. Neither of them wanted to. "Before we keep going, I'd like to know a little about you. How old are you? Where are you watching from? And have you ever found yourself believing in something after everyone else had already given up?" Caleb picked up his backpack and walked toward the information board where search coordinators had left copies of the final search map. Colored lines crossed nearly every section of the national forest. Nearly. His eyes paused on a narrow stretch along the western cliffs. The official search had marked it as inaccessible terrain. No organized team had spent more than a few minutes there. Not because they were careless. Because every decision during a rescue had to balance time, safety, and probability. Caleb understood that better than most. For the past 11 years, he had maintained hiking trails, repaired washed-out footbridges, and monitored remote sections of the park that tourists rarely visited. He wasn't a detective. He wasn't a rescue specialist. He simply spent more time listening to the mountains than most people ever would. His phone vibrated. Mason calling. Caleb answered immediately. "Hey, buddy." His 10-year-old son's sleepy voice came through the speaker. "Are you coming home for breakfast?" Caleb smiled despite the knot in his stomach. "I was planning to." A pause. "They didn't find her?" "No." Another pause. "So it's over?" Caleb looked toward the empty trail disappearing between towering pines. He remembered another search years ago. Different faces. Different weather. The same words. "We've done everything we can." He had accepted those words once. He still carried the weight of that decision. "I don't know if it's over," he finally said. Mason was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question only a child would think to ask. "If everyone else stopped looking, who's left?" Caleb closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he wasn't staring at the parking lot anymore. He was studying the western ridge, where morning fog clung stubbornly to the rocks. "I think," he said softly, "I'm about to find out." He ended the call, tightened the straps on his backpack, folded the search map, and stepped away from the road. This time, he wasn't following the search. He was following the one place everyone had decided wasn't worth searching anymore. Caleb Whitmore had learned long ago that the forest never rushed to tell its story. It whispered. Most people came looking for obvious signs. Broken branches. Fresh footprints. A dropped backpack. Caleb had spent enough years in the mountains to know those were usually the last things nature left behind. The first clues were quieter. A stream flowing differently after a rockslide. Birds refusing to settle in one stretch of trees. An animal trail that suddenly disappeared. The forest noticed everything. You just had to earn the patience to notice it too. He started climbing the western ridge just after sunrise. The trail wasn't officially closed, but few hikers used it. Storms during the previous winter had washed away long sections of the path, leaving loose shale and fallen timber scattered across the slope. His boots moved carefully, never faster than the ground allowed. Every few minutes he stopped. Not because he was tired, because he was listening. Wind pushed through the pine branches above him, carrying different sounds depending on the shape of the valley. Somewhere farther downhill, a creek rushed over exposed stone after several days of rain. A raven called once before disappearing into the gray morning sky. Nothing sounded unusual, yet something about the place still bothered him. He unfolded the weathered topographic map from his backpack and compared it with the search grid he had copied before leaving the command post. The official teams had concentrated around established hiking routes. That was logical. Most missing hikers stayed close to recognizable paths. But Vivian Ashcroft hadn't come here to complete a marked trail. According to the public reports, she had been surveying private conservation land bordering the national forest before she disappeared. That meant she may have ignored the same trails everyone else had assumed she would follow. Caleb crouched beside a patch of damp earth where thin blades of grass leaned in different directions. The marks weren't footprints. At least not anymore. Several days of rain had erased nearly everything. Still, the ground had been disturbed. Not recently, but not naturally either. He reached out, touching the softened soil with 2 fingers before quietly standing again. His phone buzzed with another message. Mason, Mrs. Collins picked me up for school. Don't worry about me. Love you, Dad. Caleb smiled. He typed back. Love you too. Finish your math homework before baseball practice. A second message arrived almost immediately. Only if you promise to be careful. He slipped the phone into his pocket. Children had an amazing way of asking the questions adults avoided. Careful. He had promised that before. Years earlier, another search had unfolded in another part of the state after heavy spring flooding. Caleb had been younger then, convinced that following instructions was always the safest choice. When supervisors ended the search, he went home with everyone else. 2 days later, the missing man was found less than a mile beyond the final search boundary. Alive when the teams left, gone by the time they returned. No one blamed Caleb. No investigation accused him of making a mistake. But he blamed himself anyway. Not because he believed he could have guaranteed a different outcome. Because he had never questioned whether the search had ended too soon. That memory had followed him ever since. It was the reason he struggled to walk away while unanswered questions still lingered. It was also the reason he sometimes stayed longer than he should. He understood that weakness. Determination could quietly become obsession if you stopped testing it against reality. So every hour, Caleb asked himself the same question. Am I following evidence? Or am I chasing regret? If the answer ever became regret, he would turn back. For now, the evidence was small, almost invisible, but it still existed. As the morning clouds slowly lifted, sunlight reached the western ridge for the first time in days. Caleb looked toward a narrow rock formation overlooking the valley. From below, it appeared impossible to reach. From where he stood now, he noticed something different. An old maintenance route, nearly hidden beneath overgrown brush, curved behind the cliff before disappearing into the trees. It wasn't marked on the public hiking map. Most visitors would never know it existed. Caleb tightened the straps of his backpack. He wasn't certain the forgotten path would lead him to Vivian. He was only certain of one thing. Nobody else had gone that way. The forgotten maintenance path was barely visible beneath years of fallen pine needles and creeping brush. Whoever had built it hadn't intended it for hikers. Long ago, park crews had used the narrow trail to inspect erosion along the western cliffs, but changing budgets and newer access roads had slowly erased it from everyday use. Caleb moved carefully, using a walking stick to test loose ground before each step. The forest felt different here. Not quieter, more patient. The usual sounds still surrounded him. Wind brushing through pine branches, squirrels moving across tree limbs, distant water. Slipping over rock, but there were fewer signs of people. No candy wrappers. No boot prints. No trail markers painted on trees. Exactly the kind of place a search team would avoid after calculating risk against probability. He couldn't blame them. Every rescue had limits. People often imagined search operations as endless efforts fueled only by determination. They weren't. They were built on available daylight, weather forecasts, exhausted volunteers, limited helicopters, fuel, medical crews, and difficult decisions no one wanted to make. Eventually, someone had to decide where searching remained reasonable. Caleb understood all of that. He simply wasn't part of that decision anymore. About an hour later, the path narrowed beside a rocky slope where spring runoff had carved shallow channels through the dirt. He stopped. One channel looked different. Rainwater usually carried leaves downhill in scattered patterns. Here, several leaves had gathered against a small stone in a way that suggested something heavier had disturbed the flow before the last storm. He knelt. There were no footprints left to examine. Days of rain had erased those. Instead, he studied what rain couldn't completely hide. A broken fern growing at knee height. thin scratches across exposed sandstone. A strip of gray fabric no larger than his thumbnail caught beneath a thorny branch. He didn't touch it immediately. Instead, he looked around. The branch itself had grown naturally. The fabric hadn't. He carefully removed it and slipped it into a small plastic evidence bag he carried for documenting damaged trails. It could belong to anyone. It could mean nothing. Or it could mean someone had passed through here before the heavy rain. He refused to let hope outrun evidence. By early afternoon, clouds rolled back across the ridge, cooling the forest once again. Caleb checked his watch. Mason's school day would be ending soon. Almost on cue, his phone buzzed. A voice message. "Dad, Coach says practice might get canceled because of the weather. Mrs. Collins said I can stay at her house if you need more time. Just don't forget to eat something." Caleb smiled to himself. His son had inherited his mother's habit of worrying about everyone else first. He listened to the message again before slipping the phone away. "I won't forget," he said quietly, though no one was there to hear him. The trail disappeared completely a few hundred yards later. From that point on, the mountain offered no guidance. Only choices. He climbed onto a broad shelf of weathered granite overlooking the valley below. From there, he could finally see why search aircraft had missed this section. The cliffs folded inward, creating deep shadows even during daylight. Thick evergreens hid narrow ledges beneath their branches, while large boulders broke every clear line of sight from above. From a helicopter, it would have looked like solid forest. From the ground, it was a maze. Caleb slowly turned in a full circle. Then he noticed something that made him stop breathing for just a moment. Far below, beyond a stand of twisted pines, a patch of bright silver reflected the weak afternoon sunlight. Not water, not exposed rock. Something smooth. Something that hadn't belonged in the wilderness. He didn't convince himself it was Vivian. He didn't even convince himself it was important. But after 6 days of organized searching, it was the first thing he had seen that nature couldn't explain. He adjusted his backpack, took one careful step toward the hidden ravine, and followed the mountain's quiet invitation deeper into the unknown. The silver reflection disappeared the moment Caleb changed his angle. He stopped walking. If he hurried now, he could easily convince himself he had seen something that wasn't really there. He stayed where he was for nearly a full minute, letting the forest settle again. A breeze shifted through the trees. Clouds drifted away from the sun. The reflection returned. Smaller this time. Still there. Caleb took out his binoculars. The distance was too great for details, but he could tell the object wasn't part of the landscape. It caught light with the smooth shine of manufactured metal, then vanished again beneath moving branches. He folded the binoculars without making any assumptions. The mountain had fooled experienced hikers before. His job wasn't to believe. It was to verify. The quickest route led straight down a steep rock face. He rejected it immediately. Loose shale covered most of the slope. One mistake would send him sliding into the ravine below. Instead, he searched for an older route that followed the natural contour of the hillside. It added nearly a mile to the hike. It also gave him a much better chance of reaching the bottom safely. By late afternoon, the air had turned noticeably colder. Heavy clouds rolled over the ridge, stealing what little warmth the sun had offered. Caleb pulled on a lightweight rain jacket and checked the batteries in his flashlight. Enough power for one night. No more. His phone displayed a single bar of service. He called Mason before the signal disappeared. "Hey, buddy. Did you find anything?" "Not yet. You sound tired." "I've had easier hikes." Mason laughed softly. "You always say that when you're climbing somewhere impossible." Caleb smiled. "Maybe." There was a brief silence. Then Mason asked, "How do you know when to stop looking?" Caleb looked toward the dark ravine below. "I ask myself one question. What is it? Have I run out of reasons to keep searching? Or have I only run out of easy places to look? And I haven't answered it yet." "Be careful, Dad." "I will." The call ended before either of them said goodbye. The signal was gone. Caleb clipped the phone back onto his pack and continued downhill. The forest floor changed beneath his boots. Pine needles gave way to damp moss and broken stone. Water trickled somewhere ahead, hidden behind thick undergrowth. Then he saw it. Not the silver object. A fresh scrape across a narrow boulder. Unlike the older weathered rock surrounding it, this mark was pale and sharp, as if something heavy had struck it only days before. Nearby, several low branches had snapped inward instead of outward. Gravity alone wouldn't have done that. Something, or someone, had moved through here during the storm. Caleb crouched beside the broken branches, studying them without touching anything. His pulse quickened, but he refused to let excitement replace judgment. The evidence still didn't prove Vivian Ashcroft had survived. It proved something much more important. For the first time since leaving the command post, the mountain was no longer asking him to trust hope alone. It was beginning to answer back. By the time darkness settled over the western ridge, Caleb Whitmore had stopped thinking about finding Vivian Ashcroft. His focus had become much smaller. One clue, then the next. Nothing more. The forest punished people who let hope race ahead of judgment. He switched on his flashlight only when the fading light made it necessary. The narrow beam swept across wet stone, tangled roots, and patches of moss glistening from the afternoon rain. The fresh scrape on the boulders still bothered him. Not because it proved someone had been there, because it pointed in a direction. He stepped around the rock instead of climbing over it. Another 20 feet brought him to a narrow opening hidden behind fallen cedar branches. From above, it looked like nothing more than a pocket of dense brush. From ground level, it revealed a shallow passage leading toward the ravine. Caleb paused. The air felt colder inside. Moisture clung to the stone walls, and the smell of wet earth grew stronger with every step. He crouched to inspect the ground. Rain had washed away nearly every footprint, but small details remained. A broken stem bent downhill. Fresh mud pressed against the side of exposed roots. Tiny pebbles gathered in unusual patterns where runoff should have scattered them. Someone, or something much heavier than a deer, had passed through before the last storm. He pulled the folded search map from his backpack. The passage wasn't marked. Neither was the ravine beyond it. He compared the terrain with the contour lines. The realization came quietly. Every official search team had approached this valley from the east because the western cliffs appeared impossible to cross. But they had never entered through this hidden drainage corridor. Not because they made a mistake. Because the entrance was almost invisible unless you were standing exactly where Caleb stood now. He folded the map again. This didn't mean Vivian was here. It meant the search grid itself had contained a blind spot. For the first time since leaving the command post, he felt something stronger than hope. He felt direction. The ravine narrowed until he had to turn sideways between two moss-covered rock walls. Water dripped steadily from above. His flashlight caught something caught between exposed roots along the stream bank. He knelt carefully. A silver clasp, no larger than a thumbnail. Attached to it was a torn piece of dark blue fabric. Not hiking gear, not camping equipment. The stitching looked expensive. Caleb turned the fragment over in his hand. He remembered seeing photographs of Vivian on the evening news before the search began. One picture showed her wearing a Navy field jacket during a conservation tour. He refused to jump to conclusions. The fabric could belong to someone else. Still, he sealed it inside a small evidence pouch. The ravine opened into a wider basin where enormous boulders formed natural walls on three sides. The wind disappeared. Everything became strangely quiet. Too quiet. Even the birds were absent. Caleb switched off his flashlight for a moment. He listened. Water. Leaves. A distant branch creaking in the breeze. Nothing else. Then he noticed something he hadn't expected. A line of broken moss stretching across one of the larger rocks. Moss usually grew evenly where shade remained constant. Here, a section nearly 3 feet wide had been scraped away recently. Not by weather. Not by animals. By repeated contact. Someone had climbed over that rock more than once. His pulse quickened. He climbed onto the boulder and scanned the basin below. The terrain formed a natural trap. Anyone injured here could easily disappear beneath the thick tree canopy while remaining completely hidden from aircraft above. Caleb slowly exhaled. The search teams hadn't overlooked obvious evidence. They had simply never reached the place where the evidence began. Night settled completely around him. He checked his remaining supplies. 1 bottle of water. Half a sandwich. Fresh batteries. Enough gear to stay until morning if necessary. He looked toward the darkness beyond the basin. Turning back now would be the safer choice. Continuing meant spending the night alone in terrain no organized. Team had searched. He thought about Mason waiting at Mrs. Collins' house. He thought about the man years ago who had been found just beyond the final search line. Then he looked once more at the hidden ravine. This time, his decision wasn't driven by regret. It was driven by evidence. Caleb adjusted his backpack, took a slow breath, and walked deeper into the darkness, following a trail that no map, and almost no one else, had ever truly seen. The temperature dropped faster than Caleb expected. By midnight, a cold mist had settled into the ravine, turning every exposed rock slick with moisture. The beam from his flashlight reached only a few yards before dissolving into drifting fog. He stopped beside a cluster of cedar trees and pulled a lightweight emergency blanket from his backpack. Not to sleep, to stay warm enough to think clearly. Fatigue was dangerous in the wilderness because it made every decision feel reasonable. He checked his watch. 12:18 a.m. Mason was probably asleep by now. Caleb pictured his son's baseball glove lying by the front door, still muddy from Saturday's practice. It was an ordinary memory, but it reminded him of why every decision out here mattered. He wasn't searching because he wanted to be a hero. He was searching because if he kept going, it had to be for the right reasons. He closed his eyes for a moment and asked himself the same question he had repeated all day. Am I following evidence or refusing to let go? He emptied the small evidence pouch onto a flat stone. The fabric, the silver clasp, the map. He traced the route in his mind. Every clue pointed in the same direction. None of them contradicted the others. That mattered. Hope could mislead. Evidence usually didn't. Satisfied, he packed everything away and continued through the narrow basin. The terrain became more difficult. Large boulders forced him to crawl through tight spaces where his backpack scraped against damp stone. Fallen logs blocked the easiest route, and thorny brush caught his jacket every few feet. Then he noticed something unusual. The stream he had been following suddenly disappeared beneath a wall of rock. He frowned. Mountain streams didn't simply vanish. They usually continued underground before emerging somewhere lower. He moved closer. The sound of flowing water remained steady, but something else mixed with it. A slow, irregular tapping. He stood perfectly still. Tap. Silence. Tap, tap. Silence again. It wasn't rhythmic like dripping water. It wasn't sharp enough to be loose branches striking each other. He switched off his flashlight. Darkness swallowed the ravine. Without the light, the sounds became clearer. Running water. Wind above the cliffs. Then, tap, tap. Very faint. Almost hesitant. Caleb's heartbeat quickened. He didn't call out. The forest had fooled people before. Echoes could bounce through narrow canyons and make sounds seem much closer than they really were. Instead, he changed position by only a few feet. The tapping became weaker. He stepped back. It grew stronger again. He repeated the process several times, slowly forming an invisible line through the darkness. The sound wasn't traveling across the valley. It was coming from somewhere below him. He aimed his flashlight toward the rock wall. Nothing. Just wet granite covered with patches of moss. Then he noticed a narrow crack hidden behind hanging vines. Cool air drifted from inside. The opening was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. Caleb crouched beside it. Fresh scratches marked the stone around the entrance. Not old weathering. Recent contact. His breathing slowed. Every instinct urged him to crawl inside immediately. Every lesson the mountains had taught him urged the opposite. Never enter an unknown space without understanding how you'll get back out. He studied the opening for several minutes. Loose stones. Escape routes. Airflow. The direction of the underground stream. Only after satisfying himself that the passage appeared stable did he remove his backpack and slide it carefully through the opening first. He followed slowly, keeping one hand against the cold rock wall. The passage widened just enough for him to kneel. The tapping had stopped. Only silence remained. Yet something had changed. The air inside was noticeably warmer than the night outside. Someone, or something, had been sheltering. Here, Caleb didn't know if Vivian Ashcroft was beyond the darkness. He only knew one undeniable truth. For the first time since everyone else ended the search, he had reached a place no one had even realized existed. Caleb remained still until his breathing slowed. Inside the narrow passage, every sound carried farther than it should. Water trickled somewhere beneath the stone floor. Tiny drops fell from the ceiling at uneven intervals. Beyond that, nothing. He switched his flashlight to its lowest setting. A brighter beam would only reflect off the damp walls and blind him. The passage curved gently to the left before opening into a small chamber carved by years of underground water. It wasn't a cave in the way most people imagined. It was more like a hidden pocket inside the mountain. The ceiling rose just high enough to stand. The floor sloped toward a shallow pool fed by the underground stream. His light swept slowly across the chamber. Broken branches. A cluster of leaves gathered in one corner. Then, a stainless steel water bottle. Caleb froze. It leaned against a rock as though someone had carefully placed it there instead of dropping it during a fall. Dust hadn't settled on its surface. Someone had touched it recently. He crouched beside it. The bottle was empty. Its outer surface carried several fresh scratches. He looked around again. Near the pool lay several smooth stones arranged in an uneven line. Not decorative. Functional. Each one sat just far enough apart to create a dry path across the shallow water. No flood would arrange stones like that. Someone had. His heartbeat quickened, but his movements remained deliberate. He crossed the stones one careful step at a time. On the far side, the chamber narrowed again. A cool draft drifted through another crack in the rock. Fresh air. That meant another opening existed somewhere beyond. He was about to move forward when a faint sound stopped him. Not tapping. Breathing. Very slow. Almost impossible to hear. He immediately switched off the flashlight. Darkness filled the chamber. He listened. One breath. Then another. Weak. Labored. But unmistakably human. Caleb resisted every instinct to call out. A frightened or injured person could panic if surprised in a confined space. Instead, he spoke calmly into the darkness. "My name is Caleb." His voice stayed low and steady. "I'm alone." No response came. He waited. Several long seconds passed. Then a faint scrape echoed somewhere ahead. Not loud enough to locate. Only enough to confirm he wasn't imagining it. "I'm not here to rush you," he continued. "I'm just trying to make sure you're okay." Silence returned. He took one slow step forward. Then another. His boots avoided loose stones that might echo through the chamber. The narrow opening widened into a second space hidden beyond the first. His flashlight remained off. Moonlight filtered through a thin crack high above, creating a pale ribbon across the stone floor. Within that narrow strip of light, he finally saw movement. A hand, thin, covered with dirt, resting weakly against the rock. Caleb didn't move closer. Not yet. He let the silence settle before speaking again. "You've been out here a long time." A faint voice answered, barely more than a whisper. "Who?" "My name is Caleb." Another pause. "Are they gone?" He understood immediately. She wasn't asking about rescuers. She was asking whether everyone had stopped looking. Caleb swallowed before answering. The official search ended. The silence that followed felt heavier than the mountain itself. Then he finished the sentence. "But I didn't." Another long pause. The weak hand trembled slightly before disappearing back into the shadows. Caleb remained exactly where he was. He had spent the entire week searching for proof that Vivian Ashcroft might still be alive. Now that he had found it, he understood something unexpected. Finding her wasn't the hardest part. Earning enough trust to bring her safely back into the world would be. Caleb stayed exactly where he was. The last thing an injured person needed was another stranger making decisions for them. His flashlight remained switched off. The thin ribbon of moonlight filtering through the crack above was enough to outline the chamber without overwhelming the darkness. "I have water," he said quietly. No answer. "I also have a first aid kit." Still nothing. He waited. In the mountains, silence wasn't always fear. Sometimes it was simply exhaustion. After nearly a minute, the weak voice returned. "Don't come too fast." Caleb nodded, even though she could barely see him. "I won't." He set his backpack on the ground several feet away and slowly removed a bottle of water, an emergency blanket, and a small headlamp. Instead of carrying everything toward her, he gently slid the water bottle across the smooth stone until it stopped within her reach. "I want you to decide when you're ready." A trembling hand appeared from the shadows. The bottle disappeared. Several slow swallows echoed through the chamber. Then silence again. Only after another minute did Caleb switch on the dim red light of his headlamp. The softer light revealed more of the narrow space. Vivian Ashcroft sat against the rock wall, with one leg trapped beneath several fallen stones that had shifted during the landslide. Dirt covered her jacket, and deep scratches marked her hands and forearms. But her eyes were alert despite the exhaustion. She had survived by collecting water from the underground stream and sheltering inside the protected chamber whenever the temperature dropped at night. "You stayed alive," Caleb said softly. She managed the faintest smile. "I was too stubborn to quit." "So was I." For the first time, a hint of relief crossed her face. Caleb carefully examined the rocks without touching them. The problem became obvious immediately. The stones pinning her leg were stable only because they leaned against one another. Removing them the wrong way could trigger another collapse. He looked up. I can't pull you out by myself. I figured, but I can keep you alive until we get help here. She closed her eyes briefly. They stopped looking. The official search did. She studied his face. You didn't? No. She took a slow breath. I kept hearing helicopters. They searched everywhere they could safely reach. I tried shouting. The storm probably swallowed the sound. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Caleb opened his first aid kit and carefully cleaned the cuts on her hands before wrapping them with fresh bandages. He checked her pulse, her breathing, and the color in her fingertips. Cold, dehydrated, weak, but still fighting. He removed the emergency blanket and tucked it gently around her shoulders. I'm going to leave for a little while. Her eyes widened. I have to. Before fear could take hold, he continued. I passed a narrow opening where I had just enough cell service to send one message. If I can reach that spot again, I may be able to contact the sheriff before daylight. What if it doesn't work? Then I come back. What if you can't find this place again? Caleb smiled faintly. I've spent half my life learning how not to get lost. She looked toward the darkness beyond him. I don't want to die here. The words hung in the cold air. Caleb answered without making promises he couldn't guarantee. Neither do I. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small whistle. If you hear rocks moving or need me before I return, blow this 3 times. She accepted it with shaking fingers. And you? I'll answer with one whistle. She nodded. No dramatic speeches. No impossible assurances. Only a simple agreement built on trust. Caleb memorized every turn leading back through the hidden passage before climbing toward the narrow crack where his phone had briefly found a signal earlier that evening. The climb was slower than before. Loose stones shifted beneath his boots. Twice he stopped to mark the route with small stacks of rocks that only someone moving carefully on foot would notice. Near the entrance, his phone came to life for just a few seconds. 1 bar, then 2. Without wasting a second, he typed a single text to the sheriff's emergency number. Alive. Hidden ravine west of old maintenance route. Need technical rescue team. I'll guide you at first light. He pressed send. The spinning icon remained on the screen. 1 second. 5. 10. Then the message disappeared. Delivered. Caleb closed his eyes for only a moment before looking east. Beyond the dark ridgeline, the first faint hint of dawn had begun to soften the horizon. The hardest part was no longer finding Vivian Ashcroft. Now he had to make sure the sunrise reached her before time ran out. The sheriff's rescue team reached the western ridge just after sunrise. Caleb met them where the forgotten maintenance path disappeared beneath the trees. The lead rescuer looked at the narrow opening in the rocks and shook his head. We never knew this passage existed. Caleb nodded. You wouldn't have seen it from above. Without wasting another second, the technical rescue crew unloaded ropes, stabilization equipment, portable medical supplies, and a lightweight lifting system designed for confined spaces. Caleb guided them through every turn he had memorized during the night. The small stacks of rocks he had left behind now became quiet signposts leading everyone safely back to the hidden chamber. When they reached Vivian Ashcroft, the paramedics immediately began assessing her condition. One medic looked at Caleb. You kept her warm. He nodded. You kept her hydrated. I gave her what I had. The medic smiled. That bought us time. Working carefully, the rescue team stabilized the loose rocks before freeing Vivian's trapped leg. Every movement was slow and deliberate. Nobody rushed. The mountain had already reminded them what happened when people underestimated danger. Nearly 2 hours later, the rescue basket emerged into the morning sunlight. For the first time in nearly a week, fresh mountain air touched Vivian's face without the weight of stone above her. The waiting helicopter crew applauded quietly as the medical team loaded her on board. Reporters gathered behind the safety line, shouting questions toward anyone wearing a rescue uniform. Who found her? How did she survive? Was it a miracle? Caleb stepped away before anyone noticed him. He wasn't interested in cameras. He looked at his phone instead. One new message. Mason, Mrs. Collins says you're on the news. Does that mean you're finally coming home? Caleb laughed for the first time in days. Yeah, buddy. I'm coming home. That afternoon, while television stations replayed helicopter footage and interviewed officials, Caleb sat on the back porch of his small house, watching Mason throw a baseball into an old practice net. Neither of them talked much. They didn't need to. After a while, Mason walked over carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "You found her." Caleb nodded. "We did." His son smiled. "I knew you'd keep looking." Caleb looked across the quiet tree line beyond their backyard. "No, I just kept paying attention." Several weeks later, the story slowly disappeared from the headlines. The rescue teams returned to work. The forest reopened. Visitors hiked the same trails without ever realizing how close they had walked to a place hidden from nearly everyone. One afternoon, Caleb received a plain envelope in the mail. There was no company logo, no expensive stationery. Inside was a handwritten note. It simply read, "Thank you for seeing a possibility after everyone else had accepted a conclusion." There was no check, no business offer, no invitation, only a signature. Vivian Caleb folded the note and placed it inside the same weathered topographic map he had carried through the search. Then he put both away. As someone telling this story from the outside, I think the real ending isn't about a billionaire being rescued. It's about the value we place on another human life. Money can change comfort. It cannot change human worth. A wealthy person deserves compassion because they are a person. A poor person deserves exactly the same compassion for the very same reason. Respect should never depend on a paycheck, a title, or the neighborhood where someone lives. The man who quietly repairs trails, the woman who leads a global company, the child waiting for a parent to come home. Each carries hopes, fears, and people who love them. When we begin judging someone's value by their wealth or their job, we stop seeing the person standing in front of us. Caleb never kept searching because Vivian was a billionaire. Had she been a teacher, a waitress, a mechanic, or someone whose name never appeared on television, his decision would have been the same. Perhaps that's the lesson worth remembering long after this story ends. The greatest measure of character is not who we choose to help when the world is watching. It's who we refuse to give up on when the world has already walked away. And every person, rich or poor, deserves to be seen, respected, and loved, simply because they are human.